Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. The province of Sylvania sits in the Empire's east, bordered by Stirland to the west and the World's Edge Mountains to the east, a territory of dark forests and poor soil and settlements that have never quite recovered from the sequence of disasters that its history produced. Other imperial provinces had their troubles, and the Empire's history was not peaceful. But Sylvania's troubles had a particular character, a tendency toward catastrophe that the province's neighbors noticed over the centuries, and that contributed to the particular reputation Sylvania carried even before the von Carstein counts arrived. The Black Plague had reached Sylvania. The undead who walked after the plague's passage had found in Sylvania's depleted population a territory with insufficient defenders and too many unburied dead. The Skaven had moved through it. The succession of von Drakenhof counts who governed the province across the centuries before 1797, Architects, had not been distinguished rulers, and their misrule had produced an aristocracy that was fractious and resentful and incapable of the kind of collective action that difficult circumstances required. When Otto von Drakenhof, the last of his line, lay dying in 1797 IC without an heir, he cursed the gods for the indignity of dying without someone to inherit the mess he was leaving. The gods, or something adjacent to the gods, arranged for a stranger to appear at the gates of Drakenhof Castle. His name was Vlad. He claimed to be the heir to a line whose name and history the dying count could not verify, and did not have the energy to dispute. He was calm and precise, and possessed of a bearing that suggested someone who had been dealing with the dying claims of old men for a very long time. He married Isabella von Drakenhof, the Count's daughter, before her father had finished dying, which solved the succession question in the most direct available fashion. He was a vampire. Nobody at Drakenhof Castle knew this yet. Sylvania before the Count. The province that Vlad inherited was not a pleasant one by any measure that the Empire applied to its territories. Its soil was poor compared to the rich farmland of Reichland or Averland. Its climate ran to grey and cold in a way that the forests enforced by blocking the warmer air from the south. Its peasant population had been reduced and traumatized by the Black Plague and by the subsequent years of undead incursion and inadequate governance, and the particular quality of hardship that is produced by living in a place where the dead are known to walk periodically had left its mark on the culture. The aristocracy of Sylvania was the aristocracy that these conditions produced. Not the refined nobility of the Empire's more prosperous regions, but a rougher kind of lord, whose grip on the peasantry beneath them was maintained through the fear that all feudal aristocracies maintain, and through the additional fear that Sylvania specifically produced in its inhabitants. A population that believed, not without reason, that the dead might rise at any time, was a population whose relationship to mortality had a specific edge that other imperial populations did not share. The witch hunters who had occasionally investigated the province over the centuries had found enough genuine darkness there to justify the investigation, and not enough concentrated evil to justify a full suppression campaign. Sylvania was unpleasant and dangerous and governed badly, but these qualities were distributed across the imperial provinces in varying concentrations, and Sylvania's particular version was not obviously worse than what occurred elsewhere in the Empire's less favoured territories. What Sylvania had, that other imperial provinces did not, was a concentration of graves. The Black Plague had killed a significant portion of the population in a short period, and the burial infrastructure of a province already stretched thin by poverty had not handled the volume well. There were places in Sylvania where the dead had been laid in ground that was not properly consecrated, in the conditions that the mortuary cult of Moor could not maintain at the level the theological standards required. The graves were there, and the bodies in them were not adequately protected, and this mattered significant for what came later. Vlad understood this when he arrived. He may have chosen Sylvania in part because of it. Vlad and Isabella. Vlad von Carstein was not a vampire who arrived by coincidence, who happened to arrive in Sylvania at a convenient moment. His history was older than the Empire, older than Sylvania as a political entity, older than most of the things that the Imperial calendar used as reference points. His origin connected to Lamia and to Nehekara, to the bloodline that had produced the first vampires through Neferata's experiments with the elixir of life thousands of years before the Empire existed. He had been known as Vashanesh in that older life, the consort of the first vampire queen, a being of enormous age and accumulated power, who had been moving through the world across the millennia since Lamia's fall, taking new names and new positions as the old ones ran their course. His connection to the Ring of Nagash was one of the most significant facts of his existence in Sylvania. The ring, a necromantic artifact of ancient power, had the property of resurrection. A vampire who wore it could not be permanently killed while the ring remained on their hand. Vlad had possessed the ring for long enough that it was part of what he was, a constant in his very long life. He had died before and come back before, and the returning was something he had learned to plan around rather than to fear. Isabella was not a hostage to the political arrangement of the marriage. She was someone Vlad had chosen, in the way that a very old being who has learned to be patient about the things that matter chooses the things that matter. She became a vampire at his hand, and the transformation was not a horror to her, but a gift, the entry into the condition that her husband inhabited, the closing of the distance between what she was and what he was. The von Carstein family that formed in the years after Vlad's arrival at Drakenhof was built around this pair. The other vampires of Sylvania, the creatures that Vlad's power and the province's particular darkness had produced over the decades of his rule, were extensions of this center. Isabella and Vlad, the Count and the Countess, ruling from the castle over a province that was slowly becoming something the Empire had not quite seen before. The long patience. The Empire of the 1800s, ITRC, was in a period the historians would later call the Anarchy. The process of succession that determined who held the title of Emperor had broken down, and the various elector counts who had the right to vote for the Emperor were instead using their votes as political leverage in the factional struggles that occupied their attention. The imperial throne was either contested or empty for extended periods across this era, and the collective military capacity of the empire, which depended on the cooperation of the elector counts, was reduced by the political divisions among them. Vlad watched this. He had the long view that very old beings develop about the relationship between current events and eventual outcomes, and the anarchy was something his very long view assessed as an opportunity that patience would convert into advantage. He did not move on the empire in the 1800s. He built. The building was subtle in the way that a very patient man builds when he has time, and when revealing the building too early would cost more than waiting. The province of Sylvania was consolidated around his authority. The aristocracy that had been fractious and resistant was absorbed into the von Carstein structure through the conversion of some lords to vampirism and the elimination of those who proved unable to be absorbed. The undead of Sylvania's many inadequately protected graves were raised and maintained as the core of what would become his army. he also attended Imperial councils. This is the detail about Vlad's approach to power that surprises the people who encounter the vampire wars, expecting a straightforward monster story. He did not lurk in Sylvania raising armies. He sent representatives to the councils of the empire. He maintained, for decades, the pretense that the Count of Sylvania was an eccentric but legitimate imperial vassal, strange in his habits and reclusive in his governance, but present in the institutional life of the empire that he intended to claim. The witch hunters who came to investigate the province never returned. The law does not detail what happened to them, but the non-return established a pattern that became one of the pieces of evidence that something was wrong in Sylvania beyond ordinary misrule. Enough witch hunters in time had gone in without coming out that the conclusion was unavoidable. By that point, Vlad had decided the patience was complete. The invitation and the rising. The moment Vlad chose to reveal what he was and what he intended is preserved in the lore with the dramatic economy that the Warhammer Fantasy narrative applies to its best moments. He invited the nobility of Sylvania to a feast at Drakenhof Castle. The invitation was the kind that a count issues to his province's aristocracy as a matter of feudal form, and the nobility came because the refusal of such an invitation carried its own political costs. They arrived at Drakenhof and found the feast that had been prepared for them. The vampire nobility of Sylvania consumed the mortal nobility of Sylvania at that feast. Not symbolically. The gathered lords and ladies of the province who had not yet been converted were the feast's intended entertainment. Vlad watched the conversion of his province's aristocracy from mortal to undead, complete in a single night at his table. Then he read from the books of Nagash, the texts that the first great necromancer had written in the temple of Khemri, which had spread through the old world across the centuries and which contained the most complete account of the dark arts ever committed to writing, were the instrument of what followed. Vlad's recitation from those texts caused the undead of Sylvania to rise, not only the undead he had maintained and organized across the years of his rule, all of them, the graves of the Black Plague dead, the inadequately buried, the badly consecrated, the accumulated weight of Sylvania's unquiet history rising at once. The army that marched out of Sylvania in 2010 IC was the product of Vlad's 2-century patience made visible. The province he had transformed was behind him. The empire that had been divided by the anarchy was ahead of him. He called himself the Count of Sylvania, and the Emperor of the Undead, and the heir of all the vampire counts would be. He declared that what the empire had been doing with its governance was the mismanagement of a territory that was rightfully his, and that the correction of this mismanagement was what he was marching to accomplish. He was calm about it, as he was calm about everything. What Vlad wanted. The question of what Vlad von Carstein was trying to achieve is one that the lore holds in a complexity that simpler accounts of the vampire wars tend to flatten. He was not a monster in the sense of a being whose only relationship to the organized world was destruction. The patience of his 2-century preparation, the care with which he had maintained the pretense of legitimate governance, the attendance at imperial councils, these were the behaviors of someone who understood the institutions he was challenging and who wanted to win within them rather than replace them with chaos. He wanted to rule the empire, not to destroy it, not to turn the old world into a wasteland of undead under a lightless sky. He wanted the throne that the emperor held, and he wanted to hold it as the vampire count who had demonstrated that he could manage a province and attend councils and operate within the imperial framework. He wanted legitimacy as much as he wanted power, and the legitimacy he sought was the particular legitimacy of someone who had done the work, rather than taken the prize without that work. This made him different from what came after. The 3 counts of the von Carstein line who prosecuted the vampire wars were not the same in what they wanted or how they pursued it. Vlad was a conqueror with a political vision. What followed was something else. Isabella died with him when the vampire war's first phase ended. She did not survive Vlad's death and did not attempt to. The Countess, who had ruled at his side across the centuries of Sylvania's transformation, took the ending of what she had built with him as the ending of what she had reason to continue. The first vampire war had produced its share of tragedy. Most of it was Sylvania's. This was the Empire's. Sleep well. Tomorrow the ring is taken, and what follows Vlad is nothing like what Vlad was. In 2010, IC, the army of Sylvania crossed the provincial border, and the vampire wars began. There had been warnings. The witch hunters who had entered Sylvania over the preceding decades and failed to return were a warning, if a quiet one, easily explained away by those whose preference was to explain things away. The stories from Sylvanian peasants who had fled the province were warnings. The character of Otto von Drake's successor, the strange count whose household kept no normal hours and whose face had not changed in the 2 centuries since he had arrived, was a warning to anyone who chose to look at it. The Empire, in 2010 IC, was not well positioned to look at anything clearly. The anarchy that had paralyzed imperial governance for generations had produced the particular institutional condition where the collective action that a major threat requires is least available. The elector counts, who would need to cooperate to address a Sylvanian uprising of any scale, were the same elector counts who had been using the imperial succession as a political instrument for their own factional purposes. They had not agreed on an emperor. They were not going to agree on a military response with the speed that the situation required. Vlad had known this. The patience of 2 centuries had included the careful observation of imperial politics across the span of the anarchy. He had watched the elector counts maneuver against each other and had assessed what this meant for the Empire's ability to respond to a sudden and unexpected threat. The assessment had been correct. The Empire's response to the First Vampire War was slower and more fragmented than the threat required. The counts who would not fall. The campaign that Vlad launched in 2010 was not a single battle or a single season's fighting. It was a sustained military effort across 40 years, the product of an army that did not tire and did not require the logistical infrastructure that mortal armies required. Led by a commander who had been planning this campaign for 200 years and who had a personal relationship with death that differed fundamentally from that of his opponents. He was killed at Middenheim in 2014. Josias, Issy, Gerrit Kruger, the Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf, cut Vlad down in the fighting around the great fortress city. The Imperial commanders who saw it happen believed the war was over. The Sylvanian army showed signs of collapsing without its master's animating presence. There was a brief lull, a moment of possible relief. The lull lasted until Vlad returned. He had died before and come back before, with the ring on his hand and the patience of a being who had long since stopped treating death as the kind of permanent condition it was for the people he fought against. His return was not unexpected to him. It was profoundly unexpected to the commanders who had watched him die and who now watched him lead his army against the Knights of the White Wolf with a focused and personal intensity that the previous fighting had not contained. The year after Vlad's return at Middenheim, The Battle of Schwarzhafen destroyed the army that Gerrit Kruger and the Elector Count of Middenheim had assembled. The military force that had believed it had ended the vampire wars was broken in the battle that followed the war's apparent ending. Gerrit Kruger was sired by Vlad in the aftermath. The Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf converted into a von Carstein vampire, the man who had killed the Count becoming one of the Count's household. This was characteristic of how Vlad handled those who impressed him. The strong who opposed him and lost were not destroyed if they had qualities he found worth keeping. They were converted and absorbed. The von Carstein family that marched through the empire was larger and stranger for each encounter of this kind. The army of the undead. The army Vlad had built in Sylvania across the 2 centuries of preparation was the product of specific calculations about what made an undead force militarily effective and what its advantages over a mortal force were. The dead did not tire. A mortal army on campaign required rest, food, the management of morale through the difficult periods that every campaign produced, the logistical apparatus of supply and reinforcement. The Sylvanian dead required none of this. They marched when Vlad directed them to march. They fought when directed to fight. They did not become afraid when the battle went badly, did not rout when a mortal army in the same position would have routed, did not require the officers and the discipline and the institutional knowledge that effective mortal armies required. What the army needed was Vlad. The necromantic power that animated and directed the undead was not distributed through the force in a way that allowed it to function without him. When Vlad died at Middenheim, the army had shown the signs of losing cohesion in the intervals before his return. The dependence on a single animating will was the army's structural weakness, and Vlad had managed it through the ring's resurrection property across the years of the campaign. He was also an effective conventional commander, which was not always the case with the undead rulers the Warhammer Fantasy World produced. His 2 centuries of preparation had included the study of Imperial military doctrine and the particular conditions of the campaigns that the Empire's history had produced. He could read terrain and manage the timing of engagements and position his forces in ways that a commander who had done nothing but undead raising would not have been capable of. The combination of an army that did not tire with a commander who understood conventional warfare made the First Vampire War something the Empire had not faced before. Not a chaos incursion, not an orc war, but a sustained campaign conducted by something with patience and structure and the ability to absorb losses in ways that mortal forces could not. The path to Altdorf. The 40 years of the First Vampire War were not 40 years of continuous advance on Altdorf. The campaign moved and paused and moved again, according to the opportunities that the Empire's fragmented response produced and the obstacles that the Empire managed to place in Vlad's path, despite its fragmentation. Talabek land fell. The army moved through the province with the methodical thoroughness that an undead force could apply when the command was to take territory and hold it. Cities that resisted were taken. Cities that surrendered without significant resistance were incorporated into the territory that Sylvania was extending westward through the empire. The populations of the fallen provinces found themselves under a new administration, the administration of the von Carstein household, with its vampire lords and its necromantic apparatus and its particular version of order. Stirland and Ostermark, the eastern provinces that lay between Sylvania and the Imperial heartland, were reduced across the campaign's middle years. The elector counts of the eastern provinces fought with varying degrees of effectiveness and coordination, and were pushed back. The coalition that the anarchy had made difficult to assemble was assembled under the pressure of what was happening, but assembled too late and in the wrong places to stop the advance at the eastern border. By the time the Sylvanian army reached Altdorf, it had been fighting for 4 decades. Vlad had been killed and returned multiple times across those decades, each return carrying the particular significance of a man who had demonstrated that the conventional tool for ending a war, killing the enemy's commander, did not work against this particular commander. The Imperial forces that faced him at Altdorf knew this and fought with the knowledge that what they were doing might not be sufficient. Grand Theogonist Wilhelm III knew it too. The Siege of Altdorf. Altdorf was the Empire's capital and its most heavily defended city. The walls that Vlad's army came to in 2051 IC were the product of generations of construction and improvement, maintained by the resources of the Empire's wealthiest province and defended by the forces that the capital could field. They were not the walls of Talabecland or Stirland. They were the walls that the Empire had built to hold against its worst threats. The siege began in winter. The season did not matter to the undead in the way it mattered to a mortal besieging army, which was one of the advantages Vlad had planned around when he chose the timing of the campaign's final phase. Winter sieges broke mortal armies as often as the besieged walls did. The Sylvanian dead continued regardless. The city held. For weeks the walls held, and the defenders' resolve held with them, under the particular pressure of a siege conducted by an enemy that did not show the signs that siege defenders watched for, the signs that told them how much longer the besieging army could sustain its effort. The Sylvanian army was not eating through supplies at a rate that projected an end. It was not suffering from disease or desertion, or the other forms of attrition that conventional sieges produced in conventional armies. What broke the siege was not a military relief force arriving from outside. It was one man's decision. Wilhelm III, the Grand Theogonist, the religious head of Sigmar's cult within the Empire, had been directing the city's defense from the walls. He was elderly. He had been fighting alongside the men of Altdorf across the weeks of the siege, in the way of a leader who had decided that the nature of the threat did not permit him the comfort of directing from a safe distance. He stood on the walls and he looked at what was below them, and he made a calculation. Vlad was on the walls. He had reached them in the fighting of the siege's final phase, as the undead assault pushed into the defenders' positions. He was there on the wall, in the midst of what was happening, with the command of his forces and the outcome of the campaign within what the siege had built toward. Wilhelm charged him, an old man, a priest, throwing himself at the most powerful vampire in the old world. The theology he served held that Sigmar's protection was real, and that what was done in Sigmar's name had force that secular weapons did not. He ran at Vlad with a prayer on his lips, and took the vampire's blade through his chest and grabbed von Carstein and bore him over the ramparts. Both of them went over. The stakes that had been placed below the battlements for defensive purposes were what met them. Vlad landed first. Wilhelm landed on top of him, driving him down further. The ring on Vlad's hand was not enough this time, because the element that the ring's resurrection property required was the continuity of the body's condition through the process of death and return, and what the stakes below the walls produced was a different situation. Vlad von Carstein, the Count who had died and returned across 40 years of the First Great Vampire War, died at the siege of Altdorf and did not return. The undead army around Altdorf began to collapse without its master's animating will. The great force that had crossed the empire from Sylvania to the capital, that had taken province after province across the decades of the campaign, lost the coherence that Vlad's power had given it. The soldiers of the Empire who had been fighting for their lives an hour before found themselves fighting enemies who were ceasing to be enemies, the animation leaving the bodies that Vlad had raised and directed across the 40 years of his war. What Isabella did at the walls, the last casualty of the siege of Altdorf, was Isabella von Carstein, the Countess who had ruled at Vlad's side across 2 centuries of Sylvania's transformation, who had become a vampire at his hand, and who had loved him in the particular way of someone who had chosen a partner and had that choice confirmed across 200 years of shared existence, was at the walls when Vlad went over them. She saw what happened. She understood what it meant. She had become a vampire because of Vlad. The unlife she had inhabited since the transformation was an unlife built around and with him. The prospect of its continuation without him was not something the law presents her as weighing at length. The decision she made at the walls of Altdorf was made in the immediate aftermath of watching the person who had made her immortal cease to be immortal. She turned the same instrument that had killed him on herself and was gone before the soldiers nearby understood what they were witnessing. The law notes that Ludwig, the man who would become emperor in the aftermath of the siege, was present. He saw it. The Grand Theogonist, who had sacrificed himself to destroy the vampire Count of Sylvania, lay dead below the walls. The Count's wife, who had ruled the Dark Province at his side, was dust at the wall's base. The siege was over. The First Vampire War was over. The successors that Vlad had never prepared for were now the problem. What the ring left behind. Vlad's copies of the Liber Mortis and the Book of Nagash were found in the looted Sylvanian camp. They were taken by the Temple of Sigmar and locked in the temple's deepest vaults. The Ring of Nagash was also there, somewhere in the devastation of the walls and the bodies and the immediate aftermath of what had ended the siege. Or it was not there, depending on which account the reader consults. The ring's location after Altdorf was disputed in the sources, but the most significant detail about it was that it ended up in Mannfred's possession in the period after the siege, along with at least 1 page from the books of Nagash that the temple's accounting had not noticed missing. The Vampire War's first phase had ended. The Count who had started them was gone, and the Countess who had accompanied him was gone, and the army that had threatened to install a vampire emperor on the Imperial throne had crumbled into the dust of its former components. What none of the victors at Altdorf understood in the immediate aftermath was that the succession dispute that followed Vlad's death was not the end of the von Carstein threat. It was a pause between its first form and its second. Fritz and Peter, 2 of Vlad's Get, attempted to prove themselves in the period immediately following. Fritz attacked Middenheim and was stopped by a silver arrow. Peter besieged Nuln with more success before being killed in his coffin by Helmut van Hol, a descendant of the necromancer Van Hel. Hans von Carstein disputed the succession in internal fighting and was killed by Konrad in a duel. Konrad von Carstein emerged from the internal competition with a claim on Drakenhof and the remains of the Sylvanian forces. He was not Vlad. He had not been built for what he had inherited. He would demonstrate this with a thoroughness that the second phase of the Vampire Wars made impossible to miss. Sleep well. Tomorrow the order that Vlad had built falls apart, and what Konrad brings to the wars that bear his family's name is something entirely different from what came before. The succession dispute that followed Vlad's death at Altdorf lasted 40 years. 40 years during which Sylvania was governed by no one, or rather, by everyone, which in the context of a collection of vampire lords with no shared hierarchy and no particular reason to cooperate with each other, produced the kind of outcome that everyone ruling anything tends to produce. The province that Vlad had consolidated across 2 centuries of patient work, fragmented in the generation after his death into competing fiefdoms, each controlled by one of his get, each pursuing its own immediate interests without reference to the larger project that their progenitor had spent his existence building. This was the best period the Empire had in the Vampire Wars. Not good, because the memories of the First War were recent, and the vampire lords who had been kept under Vlad's authority were now operating without that authority and were conducting raids and skirmishes into the Imperial provinces that bordered Sylvania. But better than what preceded it, and better than what would follow. 40 years for the Empire to rebuild the military capacity that Vlad's campaign had reduced, to replenish the population that had died in the fighting, to reassemble the institutional cooperation that the anarchy had made difficult and that the First War had made urgent. The Elector Counts used the time for this to some extent. They also used it to recommence the internal political disputes that the anarchy had produced, because the threat had passed, and the threat's absence was the condition under which political disputes resumed. The Empire, in the 40-year interval between the First and Second Vampire Wars, was doing what the Empire did in the absence of an existential threat, governing itself with the combination of effectiveness and dysfunction that its complex institutional structure reliably produced. It was also watching Sylvania's internal competition with the particular attention of a neighbour who has reason to care which of the competing parties wins. The competition for the coffin. Fritz von Carstein moved first, and with the least subtlety. He attempted to besiege Middenheim in the years immediately following Altdorf, as if the act that had killed his father might be reversed by repeating its earlier stages. He was stopped by a silver arrow before the siege had properly begun. The law does not give the arrow's owner particular prominence, which suggests that what ended Fritz was not a remarkable act of heroism, but the ordinary operation of Silver's effectiveness against vampires of his capability, at a range that a skilled archer could reach from Middenheim's walls. Hans von Carstein died in a dispute with Konrad over who was the stronger. This was not a political negotiation or a strategic calculation. It was an argument about the hierarchy of physical strength, resolved in the way that arguments of this kind tend to be resolved in the company of beings who settle disputes through combat. Konrad killed Hans and kept the pieces of him in a way that the law presents without further elaboration, which is one of those moments where the absence of detail is itself the detail. Peter von Carstein was killed in his coffin by Helmut van Hal, a witch hunter who was a distant descendant of the necromancer Van Hel. The law notes that Mannfred von Carstein is said to have aided in Peter's death, which is the most significant sentence in the succession disputes account because of what it reveals about Mannfred's operating style. He was not fighting in the open for the succession the way Fritz and Konrad were fighting. He was managing the competition from the edges, ensuring that rivals were removed without putting himself in the position of the person doing the removing. After Peter's death, Mannfred disappeared from Sylvania entirely. He left the province to Konrad's undisputed rule and vanished from the historical record for a period that would later be understood as one of the most consequential absences in the Vampire War's history. He was not idle. He was not in Sylvania. Konrad was left with what remained. Konrad von Carstein. The descriptions the law has produced of Konrad von Carstein across its various accounts are consistent in their assessment. The most violent, the most unpredictable, the one whose madness was visible and operational rather than contained and directed. where Vlad had been a strategic thinker who used his nature as an instrument of a long-term political project, Konrad was someone whose relationship to the long term was tenuous at best and absent at most times. He was known as Konrad the Butcher, Konrad the Bloody, Konrad the Beast. The names are descriptive rather than honorific. They accumulated from the specific quality of what happened in the territories he campaigned through, which was not the organized destruction that Vlad's campaign had produced, but something more immediate and less purposeful. When he came to power in Sylvania, one of his first acts was to deface the portraits of Vlad that hung in Drakenhof Castle. He declared his progenitor weak, infected with the failings of the mortal herd, too timid to have used all the powers at his disposal to destroy the empire. The critique was the inverse of everything Vlad had been. Vlad's patience and political sophistication had been the qualities that made his campaign the most serious military threat the empire had faced. Konrad's rejection of these qualities was his declaration of what the Second Vampire War would be. He was magically weaker than either Vlad or Mannfred. The necromantic power that animated and directed undead armies required a specific kind of sustained concentration and technical understanding that Konrad's particular mind was not suited to maintaining under pressure. He could raise the dead and direct them in the way that any vampire lord of sufficient age could, but the precision of the working and the scope of what he could maintain at once were less than what his predecessors had commanded. He compensated for this with the qualities he did have: raw physical power, an aggression that did not modulate itself according to tactical considerations the way that a general's aggression modulates, the willingness to be the first into any fighting and the last to leave it, which inspired the kind of following in those who wanted to be led by something that fought rather than directed. He was not a general. He was a weapon. The distinction mattered when the question of whether the Second Vampire War achieved anything strategic came to be assessed. The Second Vampire War. The war Konrad launched against the Empire began roughly around 2058 UMTNT-C and continued for over 60 years, through the late 2000s and into the 20,000s of the Imperial calendar. Its character across those decades was different from the First War in every way that mattered strategically. Vlad had fought toward a specific objective: Altdorf and the Imperial throne. His campaign had moved in a consistent direction, with setbacks that were recovered from and positions that were held while the next phase was prepared. The First War had been a campaign in the military sense, with coherent strategic intent maintained across 40 years of fighting. The Second War was what happens when the army of Sylvania is led by someone whose concept of strategic intent does not extend beyond the immediate engagement. Konrad attacked where he chose to attack. He ravaged the provinces his army entered because ravaging them was what his nature preferred to do, not because the ravaging served a purpose that his campaign required. He moved according to the logic of appetite rather than the logic of a campaign. The Moot was ravaged in 2058. The Moot, the halfling homeland in the heart of the Empire, had not been a military objective in any meaningful sense. It was attacked because it was there and because Konrad's army was in the area, and because Konrad found the distinction between what was militarily meaningful and what was not difficult to maintain. Nuln was besieged in the same period for similar reasons. The Empire's response to the Second War was affected by the experience of the First. The Elector Counts had a recent and very expensive education in what a Sylvanian campaign looked like when it was properly directed, and the absence of proper direction in Konrad's campaign was something that experienced commanders could read. He was dangerous in the way that a large and aggressive force without strategic direction is always dangerous. You could not predict where it would appear next, which made defending specific locations difficult, but you could be reasonably certain that it would not coordinate in the ways that Vlad's campaign had coordinated. There was also a complicating factor in Konrad's own household. The vampire lords who served under him were not the household that Vlad had maintained through the combination of authority and respect that a very old and very capable vampire lord commanded. Konrad's authority was based on fear and on his willingness to kill those who challenged it. Fear and the threat of violence maintain authority for as long as the feared party can make good on the threat. When the fighting goes badly enough, the calculation changes. Prologue. Mannfred watches from the distance. While Konrad's campaign burned its way through the Empire's eastern and northern provinces without achieving the strategic results that Vlad's campaign had come close to achieving, the third figure of the von Carstein succession was elsewhere. Mannfred von Carstein had departed Sylvania before Konrad's undisputed rule had been established, and the departure was not a retreat or an acknowledgement of Konrad's superiority. It was the decision of someone who understood the difference between winning a succession dispute and winning the war that the dynasty had committed itself to, and who could see that Konrad was not going to win the latter, and that association with Konrad's failure was not an outcome worth preserving the succession prize for. He went to Nehekara, the ancient desert kingdom in the south, the land of the undead pharaohs and the great pyramid tombs, which held in its architecture and its magical tradition the deepest reservoir of necromantic knowledge that the old world's geography contained. Nagash himself had emerged from Nehekara, had ruled it and corrupted it and died in it, and been driven from it, and had marked it permanently with the dark arts that the 9 books of Nagash encoded. Mannfred studied there for decades. The lore describes him spending those years reading through forbidden books, accumulating by the time of his return to Sylvania an entire library of dark lore. He was not hiding in Nehekara, he was preparing. The same quality of patience that had characterized Vlad's 2-century consolidation of Sylvania was present in Mannfred's decades in the desert. The willingness to defer the action until the preparation was complete enough to justify it. He knew what Konrad was doing in his absence. He had left a spy in Konrad's court. John Skellen, a former amateur vampire hunter who had become Mannfred's intelligence asset, observed and reported on the Second War's progress from within the Sylvanian camp. Mannfred knew the campaign's shape and its failures and its internal tensions before he returned to Sylvania to act on that knowledge. The Battle of Grim Moor. The end of the Second Vampire War came at the Battle of Grim Moor in the spring of 2121, ITOC. The Empire had assembled a combined force with dwarf allies, one of the more coordinated military responses that the Second War had produced, and met Konrad's host on ground that the Empire's commanders had chosen with the particular care that comes from having a technically superior enemy on the field and needing to minimize the points where that superiority could be applied. Konrad's elite armored warriors withstood the punishment from the Empire's and the dwarves' gun lines and war machines in the battle's opening phase, pushing forward through fire that would have broken a less committed force. The Blood Knights, who formed his cavalry, were among the most formidable fighters the vampire wars had produced across any of the 3 conflicts. The discipline that Vlad's household had maintained was not entirely absent in Konrad's force. It was more fragile, more dependent on the immediate momentum of the fight, but it was there in the engagement's first stage. Then the magic binding the undead faltered. The regiments that had been advancing under necromantic compulsion lost the animating force that kept them moving, and the skeletal soldiers and the zombies and the wights collapsed where they stood, the army's numbers visibly reducing as the battle continued. The Blood Knights, who had the autonomous awareness that the lesser undead lacked, assessed the situation and chose to leave the field. Konrad's necromancers had betrayed him. The practitioners who maintained the magical architecture of his army had decided that the campaign's trajectory and their master's management of them had reached a point where their interests were better served by withdrawal than by continuation. They left the battle. The army they had been sustaining collapsed behind them. What remained was Konrad himself and his raw will, trying to hold together what the necromancer's departure had unmade, with a technical insufficiency that had always characterized his relationship to the dark arts now exposed for what it was. The effort was too much to sustain. Something in the mechanism of his functioning broke under the pressure. He wandered away from the battle. The law's description of this is precise. In a mad fit, shouting maniacally, as if the most cruel joke the universe could devise had been played on him at the moment he could least absorb it. The army was gone. The necromancers were gone. The Blood Knights were gone. He wandered into the forest beyond the battlefield, no longer a count or a commander, but something ancient and powerful and untethered from the situation it had been embedded in. Grufbad, a dwarf hero, caught him in the forest. Elector Count Helmar, whose father had been killed by Konrad in the campaign's earlier phases, was present. He impaled Konrad with his runefang. The Second Vampire War was over. The province it had ravaged was less damaged than Vlad's campaign had left the territories it passed through, because the absence of strategic direction that made Konrad's campaign less threatening also made it less thorough. He had not held the ground he took. He had not built administrative structures in the territories his army entered. He had moved and destroyed and moved again, and what he left behind was devastation without permanence, rather than the kind of consolidated conquest that Vlad had been building toward. The Elector Counts, with the Second War finished, began to disagree with each other again. The pattern that the Vampire Wars kept producing was the pattern of civilizational attention. The threat concentrated the response. The ending of the threat dissolved it. The Empire had no way of knowing that the most significant figure in the entire Vampire Wars had spent the war studying in a desert library far to the south, and was now, in the aftermath of Konrad's death, making his way back to Sylvania with everything he had learned. Sleep well. Tomorrow, Mannfred returns from Nehekara, and the decade of patience he builds in Konrad's aftermath is the foundation of the most dangerous campaign the von Carstein line ever launched. In 2122 IC, the year after Grim Moor, Mannfred von Carstein returned to Sylvania. He came back to a province that had been used very badly by his predecessor. Konrad's tenure had not been the consolidation of Vlad's gains into something more durable. It had been the systematic consumption of those gains in campaigns that achieved nothing, and the mismanagement of the internal structures that Vlad had built. The von Carstein household that Mannfred returned to lead was smaller and more fragile than the one that Vlad had assembled, because the internal competition that had followed Altdorf and the 60 years of Konrad's rule had reduced and damaged the bloodline rather than extending it. He was not troubled by this. The return from Nehekara was the return of a being who had spent the intervening decades doing what he had set out to do, and who had come back with the resources that the doing had produced. The dark library he had assembled in Nehekara contained knowledge that the von Carstein bloodline had not previously possessed. His own magical capability had grown across the years of study with the disciples of Nagash in the ruins of Lamia, to the point where his command of the necromantic arts exceeded what either Vlad or Konrad had achieved and exceeded what most of the Old World's practitioners of the dark arts could claim. He had also made a pact. The Wraith Wizards, who still served Nagash in the south, had exchanged their secrets for his promise of aid in their own project, which was the eventual resurrection of the great necromancer himself. The von Carsteins had been working toward this goal for centuries, accumulating the relics of Nagash's reign and studying the conditions that a true resurrection would require. Mannfred's years in Nehekara had brought him to the edge of understanding what the full restoration of Nagash would require, and the pact he had sworn was the formalization of his commitment to seeing it done. This was not a plan for the immediate future. The resurrection of Nagash was a project that would require conditions that the Vampire Wars timeline had not yet produced. It would require decades more preparation, particular ritual components that could not be improvised, and a sacrifice of specific quality. Mannfred was patient enough to hold the ambition at the appropriate distance and attend to the more immediate question of what he was going to do with Sylvania and the Empire. The decade of silence. For a full decade after his return, Mannfred allowed the Imperial contenders to believe that the threat of Sylvania was over. This was the most sophisticated single strategic decision that any of the 3 von Carstein counts made across the entire span of the Vampire Wars. Not the raising of armies, not the campaign planning, not the tactical decisions in the battles that would follow. The decision to be absent from Imperial attention for 10 years, to let the province that had been the source of 2 generations of war recede from the consciousness of the people responsible for defending the Empire against it. The Empire's institutional attention was not a fixed resource that it distributed evenly across all threats at all times. It was a political resource, shaped by what the people who allocated it believed about the current state of the threats. 2 vampire wars had ended, with the Empire's forces winning or surviving, and the Sylvanian threat retreating. The pattern of defeat and recovery that the Vampire Wars had produced was itself a pattern that could be exploited by someone who understood it. Mannfred understood it. He waited and he built. He built alliances with vampires beyond Sylvania's borders, including the Sisterhood of the Silver Pinnacle, a community of vampire lords and ladies whose own ambitions and capabilities extended beyond what Sylvania could produce alone. The network of undead that his preparations were assembling was not the Sylvanian army that Vlad had raised from the province's graves. It was something with broader foundations, drawing on the dark traditions that Mannfred's Nehekaran studies and his pact with Nagash's servants had given him access to. He was also raising the dead in Sylvania with the care and the precision that his superior necromantic ability allowed. Where Konrad had raised whatever was available and directed it with whatever force his raw will could apply, Mannfred was building an army with the patience of someone who intended it to last through a campaign longer and more demanding than either of the previous 2 had been. The witch hunters who watched Sylvania reported something in these years, but what they reported was ambiguous. Something was happening in the province, but it was happening quietly, and quietly was not the register that Imperial attention focused on when it was focused on the Dark Province. The screams that peasants reported hearing on the wind were screams from a territory that had been producing screams for decades. They were harder to prioritize when Sylvania was not actively at war. He bided his time wisely. The law's formulation is precise. Mannfred had bidden his time wisely, and by 2132 IC, he was ready to move. What Mannfred was. The character of Mannfred von Carstein in the Vampire Wars lore is the character that the series had been building toward since Vlad's campaigns established what a von Carstein count at the height of their capability could accomplish. Vlad had been powerful and patient and politically sophisticated. Konrad had been violent and chaotic, and had demonstrated what the bloodline looked like without those qualities. Mannfred was the synthesis, or rather, the surpassing. He had Vlad's patience and exceeded it. He had Vlad's political calculation and extended it beyond the Empire's borders. He had magical abilities that Vlad had not possessed to the same depth, and he had the Dark Library from Nehekara that gave those abilities a breadth of application that neither of his predecessors had been able to match. Where Vlad had ruled through iron authority and personal presence, Mannfred governed through calculation. The spy he had placed in Konrad's court, John Skellen, had been the instrument of a decade of intelligence gathering that gave Mannfred a detailed picture of the Empire's state and the Sylvanian situation before he returned to act on it. He preferred to know rather than to assume, and to act when the knowledge was sufficient, rather than when the impulse was strong. He was not loved by the creatures he commanded. In the way that some commanders generate loyalty, he was respected in the particular way of beings who have demonstrated that they understand the situation better than you do, and that following their direction produces better outcomes than not following it. The vampire lords who served under Mannfred served him because his competence made his authority credible, not because he had inspired them with anything resembling affection. He also understood his own nature and his bloodline's nature with a clarity that made his planning more sustainable than Konrad's had been. He knew what the von Carstein line was trying to do. He had the historical perspective that came from access to the Dark Library and from the pact with Nagash's servants, and that perspective placed the Vampire Wars in a context larger than the immediate question of Sylvania versus the Empire. The Vampire Wars were not, in Mannfred's understanding of them, about whether a vampire count could sit on the Imperial throne. That had been Vlad's ambition, and it had produced an impressive campaign and a failure at the last obstacle. What Mannfred was working toward was something with a longer horizon. The Third Vampire War begins. In the winter of 2132 IC, while the Empire was in the grip of a vicious internal civil war, Mannfred launched his first strike. The timing was characteristically precise. The Imperial Civil War had distributed the military resources that would otherwise have been available to defend the provinces against an external threat, and had occupied the political attention of the elector counts with the internal dispute that was the proximate cause of the fighting. A threat from Sylvania in the middle of an Imperial Civil War would find less coordinated opposition than the same threat in a period of Imperial unity. The winter was also characteristic. The First Vampire War had launched in the more conventional campaigning seasons. The undead did not experience winter as a constraint on military operations in the way that mortal armies experienced it, and a winter campaign found the Empire's defending forces in the condition that winter produced in armies not deployed under active threat, stationed, cold, reduced in readiness. The surprise that the decade of silence had enabled was compounded by the seasonal surprise. The army that came out of Sylvania in 2132 RCC was not Konrad's army. It was larger, more precisely constructed, animated by superior necromantic skill, and led by a commander who had been planning the campaign it would fight for 10 years. The years of preparation had produced an instrument that the decade of silence had ensured would encounter an empire that had, to the extent that institutional attention allows anything, forgotten that the instrument existed. The early battles of the Third War went to Mannfred. not through the overwhelming force that Vlad had occasionally commanded in the First War's best moments, but through the application of planning and timing against a defender whose planning and timing had been directed elsewhere. The provinces that bordered Sylvania found themselves fighting the Vampire War's third iteration before the central imperial institutions had processed that the wars had resumed. The pattern of the First War's early phase, where the Empire's fragmentation during the Anarchy had allowed Vlad's campaign to gain ground before a coherent response could be mounted, repeated itself in a different key. The Empire in 2132 IC was not in the Anarchy in the institutional sense, but the civil war that occupied its internal politics in the decade of Mannfred's preparation had produced a similar effect. The collective military capacity was oriented toward a different problem when the external threat arrived. Over a dozen battles were fought across the next 2 decades, from 2124 to 2145-IC. The pattern of those battles, the series of engagements that would end at Hel Fenn, was not the pattern of a campaign with a clear narrative of advance and retreat. It was the pattern of sustained warfare between 2 forces, neither of which could deliver the decisive blow that would end the conflict. Mannfred could raise more dead than the Empire could kill across the sustained period of a long campaign. The Empire could field armies of living soldiers whose motivation and flexibility and tactical adaptability exceeded what the undead could provide. Each side had structural advantages that the other could not match, and the campaign that emerged from the decade of silence was the expression of these structural advantages working against each other across 20 years of fighting. The Third War had begun. The reckoning that the decade of silence had been preparing for was now in motion, and the setting that would give it its name was waiting in the swamps of Stirland. Sleep well. Tomorrow the armies converge at Hel Fenn, and what happens in the Dark Water there will define what remains of the von Carstein line. The Third Vampire War lasted 20 years, from 2124 to 2145 EIC, and its shape across those 2 decades was the shape of attrition rather than the shape of a decisive campaign. Neither side could deliver the blow that would end it. The Empire could inflict serious casualties on Mannfred's army in the battles that came to be called the Winter War, could disrupt his advance and push his forces back from the positions they had taken. Mannfred could replenish his forces after a great victory, raising new dead from the territory he held and maintaining the numerical strength of his army across losses that would have ended a mortal force. The cat and mouse pattern that emerged from this structural reality was the defining experience of the Third War for the Imperial commanders who fought it. They could win a battle and watch the victory's consequences dissolve as the defeated force reconstituted itself. They could not end the war through military success in the conventional sense, because the war's continuation depended on Mannfred himself, rather than on the specific forces he was fielding at any given moment. Mannfred knew this too. The campaign he was running was not aimed at a single decisive engagement. It was aimed at wearing down the Empire's will to continue through the sustained cost of fighting an enemy who could not be worn down in the same way. A campaign of attrition conducted from the position of the attritioning force, which is a structurally unusual situation in military history. The side that should be winning the war of resources was the mortal one, and the side that was trying to exhaust the mortal one's will was the undead. It was working, for a time. The provinces that shared a border with Sylvania were spending themselves in a war that was not producing the outcomes that wars are supposed to produce: territorial control, decisive battles, endings. The elector counts who managed these provinces were making the political calculations that prolonged stalemates produce. Then Mannfred overreached. The Siege of Altdorf. In the campaign's climactic push, Mannfred laid siege to Altdorf. The third time an undead army had pressed against the Empire's capital across the span of the Vampire Wars. Vlad had taken it to the walls and died there, and now Mannfred had brought his army to the same destination by a different route. The siege of the Third War's Altdorf was not the siege that Vlad had conducted. Vlad had approached Altdorf as the culmination of a 40-year campaign that had swept through the eastern provinces in a consistent westward advance. Mannfred's approach was the result of a different kind of campaign, one that had achieved less territorial consolidation and more damage, and the army he brought to Altdorf was an army that had been through 20 years of the attrition warfare that the Third War had produced. The Grand Theogonist was inside the walls. The Rite of Unbinding, a sacred text of Sigmar's cult that had the property of dissolving the necromantic bonds that animated the undead, was recited from the walls of Altdorf, while Mannfred's forces pressed against the city. The effect of the rite's recitation was what it had been designed to produce. The animated dead that Mannfred's necromantic power was sustaining lost the animating force and ceased to function. The siege broke. Mannfred withdrew. He also attempted Marienburg, the great trading city in the Empire's northwest, and was repulsed there as well. The campaign that the Decade of Silence had been preparing for, that the Decade of Careful army building had been directed toward, had produced siege attempts at the Empire's two most significant cities and had failed at both. The withdrawal from both cities changed the Third War's shape. What had been a campaign of attrition with Mannfred controlling the initiative became a pursuit, with the Empire's forces pressing against his retreating army as he moved back toward Sylvania. The lesson of the First War, when Vlad's defeat at Altdorf, had been followed by the surviving vampires dispersing and rebuilding to fight again, had been absorbed by this generation of Imperial commanders. The Elector Count Martin of Sturland, who commanded the coalition forces pursuing Mannfred, had inherited the understanding that allowing the von Carstein line, time and space to recover after a defeat was how the Vampire Wars perpetuated themselves. He maintained the pursuit. Mannfred's retreat went north, into Ostermark, and then the pursuit turned it back into Sylvania. At the Battle of Horstenbad, nearly half of Mannfred's army was destroyed as it moved down a forest road, caught in conditions that the rearguard fighting of a pursuit imposed. The force that had laid siege to Altdorf was being reduced piece by piece. He retreated deeper into Sylvania, toward the territory that the von Carstein line had held since the very beginning of the Vampire Wars. The Empire's coalition followed him in. Hel Fenn. The swamp called Hel Fenn lay in the north of Sylvania, along the banks of the River Ster, between the Van Holdenschlosser and the town of Waldenhof. It had a history before the Battle of 2145 AIC made it the name everyone knew. In ages past, the tribes of men who had lived in the region had buried their dead in the swampland. When the great warpstone showers came, Hel Fenn had boiled and churned and spewed forth a multitude of the old dead, the rotted corpses of centuries erupting from the water and mud to engulf the surrounding villages. The dark magic that saturated the swamp made it a place of advantage for the undead and a place of danger for the living. The Empire's army that followed Mannfred into it paid a price before the battle began. A quarter of its strength was lost in the march through the swamp. The grasping hands that emerged from the chill water pulled soldiers to their deaths. The ghost lights that appeared in the marsh at night drew sentries into positions from which they did not return. Former comrades who had been killed in the approach rose in the darkness and attacked the camps. The army that emerged from this approach to face Mannfred's remaining forces was smaller and more damaged than the army that had entered Hel Fenn in pursuit. Martin of Stirland deployed it with the care of a commander who understood that the margin for error had narrowed considerably. The ridge before a hill that the artillery crews called Thunder Ridge, a position that used the terrain's natural features to offset some of the swamp's disadvantages. Mannfred's tactical plan for the battle was the kind of plan that his understanding of conventional warfare allowed him to construct. His main force advanced across the plain toward the Imperial lines, drawing the attention of Martin's artillery on Thunder Ridge and the focus of the Imperial command. The movement was intended as a distraction. From the right flank, Black Knights and the heavy cavalry that had survived the retreat from Altdorf and the Horstenbad appeared from concealment. The plan was the pincer, the main force holding the Imperial attention, while the cavalry came around to strike where the position was thinner. The plan was read. Martin of Stirland's artillery had been positioned to address both threats, and the cavalry's emergence from cover brought them into the fire that the gun crews had already calibrated for. The assault that should have delivered the flanking blow lost its momentum in the fire, and the undead infantry pressing from the front was being held by the Imperial centre and the dwarf allies who had arrived in the woods to reinforce the left. The battle turned. The undead army, which had survived its long retreat by Mannfred's sustained necromantic effort, began to lose the coherence that effort maintained as the battle's outcome clarified. Mannfred knew. The ring, the runefang, and the swamp. He left the field. The lore is specific about this. Mannfred von Carstein departed the Battle of Hel Fenn while it was still being fought, in the particular manner of someone who has assessed the outcome and decided that survival is more valuable than the battle's conclusion. He had been in the Vampire Wars since before the Third War's beginning, had outlasted Vlad and Konrad and every other claim on the von Carstein succession. He was not going to be the last casualty of a losing battle if the assessment could be made quickly enough to act on. Martin of Stirland pursued him. The Elector Count mounted on his griffin gave chase into the marshes beyond the battle's edge, into the dark water and the mud and the ghost lights that Hel Fenn produced for everyone who entered it. He caught Mannfred at Shadow Lake, at the swamp's further edge, with white bodyguards providing whatever rear guard the fleeing Count had managed to assemble. Jerich von Carstein was there, the vampire who had begun as Jerich Kruger, the Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf, who had killed Vlad at Middenheim and been sired by him in response, who had turned against the von Carstein line after the deaths of his companions, who had been the intelligence source for the coalition's pursuit of Mannfred across the Third War. He had been working against the family he had been made part of since Grim Moor. Jerich tore off Mannfred's left hand, the hand that wore the Carstein ring, the ring that Vlad had possessed, the necromantic artifact whose resurrection property had allowed Vlad to die and return across the 40 years of the First War. Without the ring, the protection that the ring provided was gone. Martin of Stirland struck with his runefang. The enchanted blade of the Elector Count's station, the runefang orc hewer, cleaved into Mannfred's flesh. The wounds were such that what remained could not sustain even a vampire's capacity for recovery. The body sank into the dark water of the swamp. Neither human nor dwarf found it afterward. The search was conducted with the particular thoroughness of a coalition that had spent 20 years learning that the von Carstein line had a way of continuing past endings that had seemed decisive. The body was not there. The swamp was deep and dark, and the dark magic that saturated it did not cooperate with searches. Jerich von Carstein took the ring. a dwarf warrior named Khalad, who had been the ring's hunter for years and who had his own reasons for ensuring it was never used again, bricked Jerick and the ring into a sealed location that neither Khalad nor Jerick would ever leave. The ring that had made Vlad's resurrection possible across 40 years was gone from the accessible world, sealed away with the vampire who had made its removal at Hel Fenn possible. Mannfred von Carstein was dead. The body the swamp held did not contain the ring, and without the ring, the resurrection that had worked before could not work again. The Third Vampire War ended. The Vampire Wars ended. Sylvania was annexed by Stirland. No other elector wanted it, which was an efficient summary of the province's status in imperial politics after 135 years of being the source of the most sustained military threat the Empire had faced since the time of Sigmar. Martin of Stirland claimed it by right of battle, and the other electors declined to contest a claim on a territory so thoroughly devastated and so thoroughly cursed. The dead of Hel Fenn did not rest. The dark magic unleashed in the battle continued to saturate the swamp, and the soldiers who had died in the approach and in the fighting rose as stumbling undead, trapped in the swampland by the same forces that had made it the last battlefield of the Vampire Wars. Hel Fenn remained a haunt of vampires and necromancers who came to harvest the undead that the swamp continued to produce. The dark magic of a century of vampire lordship and one last battle soaked into the ground and refusing to dissipate. The von Carstein ring was sealed away. The von Carstein line, as a ruling power, was finished. Sylvania was a province of Stirland, administered by the counts who had at last put down what the province had produced. 377 years later, in Castle Drakenhof, something moved. Sleep well. Tomorrow we look at what the Vampire Wars left behind, what Sylvania became in the centuries after Hel Fenn, and what Mannfred had been building toward the entire time, the project that the Vampire Wars were always in service of. The Empire had won. This was not a qualified statement or a diplomatic formulation. The Vampire Wars were over. The von Carstein line as a ruling power was gone. Sylvania was annexed, and the territory that had produced 3 generations of undead invasion was now administered by the Elector Count of Stirland. The people who had watched the Vampire Wars from inside the affected provinces and who had survived them understood the ending as what it was, the conclusion of the most sustained military threat the Empire had faced in centuries. The celebrations were real, the exhaustion was real, the damage to the eastern provinces was real, in the way that 135 years of intermittent warfare produces real damage. Populations reduced, agricultural systems disrupted, the institutional knowledge of affected regions diminished by the deaths of the people who had carried it. Rebuilding what the 3 campaigns had unmade would take generations, in the eastern provinces that had borne the brunt of the fighting, and in Sylvania itself. Sylvania under Stirland was not immediately a peaceful province. The annexation had been declared and accepted by the other elector counts, with the relief of people who were glad the problem was dealt with, and the suspicion that dealing with it might turn out to be more complicated than the declaration suggested. The dark magic that saturated the province did not clear because the political arrangements changed. The graves of Sylvania, which had been the foundation of Vlad's army and the resource that each successive von Carstein count had drawn on, were still there. The inadequately consecrated dead were still there. Hel Fenn still produced undead from its water and mud. What had changed was that there was no one directing these resources toward an organized military purpose. The vampires who had survived the Third War, the lesser lords and ladies who had populated Sylvania's aristocracy, under the von Carstein family's authority, scattered or went to ground in the aftermath of Mannfred's death. The province's supernatural threats became diffuse rather than concentrated, more difficult to address in some ways because diffuse threats did not present a clear target, but less capable of the organized assault that had made the vampire wars so dangerous. Stirland's administration of Sylvania was not comfortable. The witch hunters who moved through the province in the decades after Hel Fenn found enough to keep them occupied. The peasant population that had lived under the von Carstein counts emerged from the period of the wars in the particular psychological condition of people who had spent generations in close proximity to the dead. Their folklore preserved what the official histories elided. They knew things about the province that the Imperial administrators who arrived from Stirland did not know, and were not always believed when they said so. What 3 centuries built? The 377 years between Hel Fenn and the first stirrings of Mannfred's return to the world were not quiet years. The Old World's history did not pause because the vampire wars had ended. The storm of chaos came and nearly broke the Empire from outside. Internal struggles continued. The machinery of Imperial politics kept producing what Imperial politics produced. But in Sylvania, in the province that Stirland had annexed and had never quite integrated, something was working. The von Carstein project had not been only the vampire wars. The wars had been the most visible part of it, the part that the Empire's histories recorded, the part that involved armies and battles and the accumulated death toll of 135 years of fighting. But the von Carsteins, Vlad most certainly, and Mannfred most explicitly, had been working towards something larger than the Imperial throne for longer than the histories that focused on the military campaigns acknowledged. The 9 books of Nagash, the texts that the first great necromancer had written in the temples of Khemri, that had spread through the old world across the centuries of Nagash's influence, that had been copied and hidden and lost and found again across the millennia since Khemri's fall. Vlad had possessed at least one of them, the copy that had been found in the Sylvanian camp at Altdorf and locked in the temple of Sigmar's vaults. Mannfred had spent his years in Nehekara, accumulating the library that the pact with Nagash's servants had purchased. The purpose of the accumulation was the project that Mannfred had sworn to aid, the resurrection of Nagash, not a symbolic resurrection, not the working of magic in the name of the great necromancer to achieve local effects. The actual resurrection of the being who had been the most powerful practitioner of death magic the world had ever produced, whose ambition had been total dominion over all death, whose defeat had not been permanent in the way that ordinary death was permanent. The von Carsteins had been secretly working toward this goal for centuries. The law records. It was not Mannfred's private ambition, though his time in Nehekara and his pact with the Wraith Wizards had given him the most direct relationship to it. It was the project that underlay the dynasty's existence, the thing that the vampire wars, with all their cost and all their failure, had been in service of. The vampire wars had failed at what they appeared to be about, installing a von Carstein count as emperor. They had advanced what they were building toward, accumulating knowledge and power and relics of Nagash's reign toward the conditions that a true resurrection would require. Mannfred in the swamp. The body that Martin of Stirland's Runefang had cut into the dark water of Hel Fenn had been gone when the search began. The ring was gone, sealed with Jerick von Carstein in Khalad's sealed location. The resurrection property that the ring had provided was unavailable. But Mannfred von Carstein was not an ordinary vampire, and the dark magic that saturated Hel Fenn was not an ordinary environment, and the pact he had made with the servants of Nagash had produced a connection to the currents of death magic that were not cut by the Runefang's wounds and the swamp's depth. The lore is imprecise about the mechanics of Mannfred's survival at Hel Fenn, because the imprecision is the point. What happened in the swamp over the centuries between 2145 and 2522 IC is a process that the surviving records do not describe clearly. What is known is the outcome. In 2505 IC, a poet and adventurer named Felix Jaeger claimed to meet Mannfred von Carstein in Drakenhof Castle. The meeting was not a ghost sighting or a hallucination attributed to the region's supernatural reputation. It was an encounter with a being who had survived something that should have been unsurvivable over a period of 3.5 centuries. The body that had sunk into Hel Fenn had not remained there. By 2505 IC, Mannfred was in Drakenhof Castle, which was no longer administered by Stirland's officials, which had been reclaimed by the province's supernatural geography in the way that such places are reclaimed when the administrative attention moves elsewhere. He was not at full strength. 3.5 centuries of the swamp and the slow process of whatever restoration his connection to death magic had allowed were not the same as 3.5 centuries of active preparation. He was aware, he was present, he was Mannfred. He was not the Mannfred who had besieged Altdorf. That Mannfred needed more time. Felix Jaeger's account of the meeting was not taken seriously by the institutions of the Empire that might have acted on it. A poet's claim about a vampire in a castle in Sylvania was not the kind of intelligence that the witch hunter's office prioritized when it had more concrete problems demanding attention. By the time the Empire understood what had returned to Drakenhof, Mannfred had been back long enough to matter. The return. In 2522 IC, rumours began to circulate in Stirland. Castle Drakenhof was inhabited again. Screams carried on the wind from the direction of the province that Stirland had been administering for 377 years. People were going missing in the way that people went missing in Sylvania under the von Carstein counts. Mannfred had rebuilt, not to the scale of the Third Vampire War's army, not yet, to the scale of a vampire lord who had spent 17 years in Drakenhof, recovering what the centuries in the swamp had cost him, using the dark library that had survived the wars, drawing on the relics of Nagash's reign that the von Carstein line had been accumulating for generations, working toward the project that the vampire wars had been in service of. The storm of chaos was simultaneous with his return to power, which was not coincidence. The timing was Mannfred's. The chaos invasion that pressed against the Empire's northern borders in 2522 IC required the kind of concentrated Imperial military response that left Sylvania with less attention and fewer resources directed toward it than it needed. He had watched the Empire's attention before. He had read what the storm of chaos would require of the Empire's military capacity. He broke Archaon's horde himself in this period, in one of the more remarkable acts in the history of the Vampire War's aftermath. A von Carstein count defeating the army of the Everchosen of Chaos and then returning to Sylvania. The lore notes this without quite explaining it. Mannfred at this point was something different from what the 3 Vampire War counts had been. Not yet at the full power that the years in Drakenhof would produce, but capable of a military engagement that ended an apocalyptic threat, and with no interest in the credit or the Imperial gratitude that the act might have purchased. He returned to Sylvania because what he was building required Sylvania. The project was the project. The storm of chaos was not the project. Defeating Archaon was, in the Mannfred von Carstein accounting, an operational matter that needed addressing before it disrupted what mattered. What mattered was the condition for Nagash's return. Mannfred knew by 2522 IEC that the conditions were approaching. The accumulated lore of Nehekara and the von Carstein library and the pact with the Wraith Wizards had produced an understanding of what a true resurrection would require, the rituals of ancient Nehekara, and the sacrifice of a powerful and innocent soul. The end times were coming. Mannfred had been building toward them since before the Third Vampire War began, in the centuries since Hel Fenn, while the Empire had been administering Sylvania and believing the vampire wars were over. The project had been working. The wars had been a means. The project was the end. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the final part. What the vampire wars were, what each of the three counts was trying to do, and why it mattered, and what Mannfred's return in the end times produced from everything the three wars had built toward. The three counts of the von Carstein line were not the same. This has been visible across the preceding parts of this series, in the different quality of each count's campaign, and each count's relationship to the province and the dynasty they were claiming. But sitting with the differences and what they produced, now that all three wars have been traced to their conclusions, produces something worth understanding about what the vampire wars were across their full span. Vlad was the dynasty's conception. He arrived in Sylvania with a plan that was already decades old, and began the patient work of converting what he found into what he needed. He understood politics and military strategy, and the particular relationship between patience and power that long-lived beings sometimes develop. He wanted the Imperial throne, and he pursued it with a particular combination of genuine capability and genuine ambition that produces the most dangerous campaigns. He also had a relationship to his province that none of his successors possessed. Vlad had governed Sylvania for 2 centuries before the First Vampire War began. He knew the province's peasants and aristocracy and geography and dark history in the particular way of a ruler who has administered a territory for long enough to understand it. His failure at Altdorf was not a failure of preparation or understanding. It was a failure of the specific vulnerability that a man who can die and return introduces into a campaign. The assumption that the ring would continue to function as it had, that the death and return cycle that had carried him through the previous decades would carry him through this one. It did not. The ring's protection was absolute until it wasn't, and the condition that ended it was not one that Vlad had successfully planned for. Konrad was the dynasty's worst expression. He had Vlad's physical power without Vlad's strategic intelligence, Vlad's immunity to mortal fatigue without Vlad's patience, Vlad's access to Sylvania's undead without Vlad's understanding of what to do with them. The Second Vampire War was the demonstration of what the von Carstein line looked like without the qualities that had made the First War as dangerous as it was. He was not a failure alone. He was the dynasty's necessary failure, in the sense that any long project that involves succession must in time test what happens when a poor successor inherits. The internal competition that followed Vlad's death at Altdorf and produced Konrad's undisputed rule was the test. The 60 years of the Second Vampire War were the result. Mannfred was the dynasty's completion. He had everything that Vlad had in greater depth, and he had the additional decades of Nehekaran study and the pact with Nagash's servants that extended his capabilities and his project beyond anything the First War's count had been working toward. He also had the patience to watch Konrad fail and depart rather than compete head-on. the intelligence to understand that the succession competition was not the important contest, and the planning to use the time that Konrad's tenure provided to prepare for what was at stake. The 3 wars across 135 years produced, in the end, the conditions for what the wars had been in service of. What Sylvania left behind. The province that the vampire wars had been conducted from was not unchanged by them. Sylvania, under the von Carstein counts, had been transformed from the badly governed rump territory of the von Draak line into something with a specific character that the Imperial administration, which followed the annexation, could not erase. The transformation was in the soil and the water and the dark magic that had accumulated across 2 centuries of active necromancy and 3 major campaigns of undead warfare. The graves were deeper and more numerous. The inadequately consecrated dead were more thoroughly integrated into the provincial landscape. The peasant population that had survived the wars carried a relationship to death, and the undead that no amount of Stirland administration or Sigmarite mission work was going to convert into something comfortable. Sylvania produced vampires. Not at the rate it had produced them under Vlad's careful cultivation, not with the organization of a count who was selecting and managing the process, but the province's dark magic and the remnants of the necromantic traditions the wars had saturated it with continued to produce the category of creature that had governed it, in smaller numbers and without the dynastic structure the von Carstein line had provided. The witch hunters who worked Sylvania in the centuries after Hel Fenn had employment. The province that Stirland had annexed as a problem resolved turned out to be a problem ongoing at a lower level of intensity and without the organized military threat, but persistent in the way that territories shaped by centuries of dark magic are persistent in their particular character. This was the world Mannfred returned to in 2505 IC, when Felix Jaeger met him in Drakenhof Castle. Not the Sylvania of the Vampire War's height, but recognizably the same province, its supernatural character maintained across the centuries of Imperial administration by the simple fact that what had been done to it during the wars could not be undone by changing who governed it. Mannfred and the End Times. The End Times, when they came in the 25th century of the Imperial calendar, were the culmination of processes that had been building for centuries. Nagash's resurrection was among these processes, and Mannfred was the instrument of it in the specific sense that the pact he had sworn in Nehikara centuries before had committed him to aid the Wraith Wizard's project of restoring the great necromancer to the world. He worked with Arkan the Black, Nagash's most faithful servant, in the preparation of the ritual that the resurrection required. The ritual components that a true resurrection needed had been identified across the long years of study that the pact had produced. The sacrifice of a powerful and innocent soul was the condition that had remained unmet for the longest time. When the conditions were met, when the ritual was performed, when Nagash returned to the world in the specific and terrible way of a being whose ambition was total dominion over all death, coming back from a death that had not managed to hold him. Mannfred was there. He had worked for this across the centuries since Nehikara. The von Carstein dynasty that had started with Vlad's patient consolidation of Sylvania and had been aimed at its deepest level at this moment was represented in the End Times by the last of its line. Nagash rewarded Mannfred with the title of Mortarch of Night and a new mount, the dread abyssal Ashigorath. He also punished him for the thought crime of considering treachery against the great necromancer. Nagash brought back Vlad von Carstein from the dead. The return of Vlad caused most of Mannfred's supporters to reconsider their allegiances when they discovered that the dynasty's founder had returned, a discovery that Mannfred experienced as the kind of complication he had spent centuries trying to avoid. Vlad and Mannfred were both Mortarchs in the End Times' final phase. Both were instruments of Nagash's campaign. They were not at peace with each other, which was not a surprise given the history, and the tension between them was one of the internal complications of the undead coalition that assembled for the End Times conclusion. The final battle at the heart of the End Times included all of this. Nagash's forces, the Chaos Powers, the Elven Coalition, the Empire's last defenders. Mannfred, in the chaos of that final engagement, made the decision that the histories of the old world that survived the End Times recorded with a specific judgment he could have held. The coalition against chaos needed what his forces could provide in that moment. He chose not to hold. He withdrew his forces from the position they were defending, the position that the coalition's plan required to be held, and the withdrawal opened the gap that the chaos forces pressed through. The world ended. The world that was consumed by chaos. The Age of Sigmar began from the debris. Mannfred's betrayal of the coalition at the end was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. He had spent centuries working toward Nagash's resurrection, had been one of the primary instruments of the End Times' preparation, and in the final moment had made a calculation about his own position and interests that produced the worst possible outcome for everyone else. The man who had been the most cunning of the three von Carstein counts, whose patience had outlasted 2 of his predecessors and 3 centuries of swamp, made the decision that his line had always been capable of making, the decision that served Mannfred's interests regardless of what it cost. It cost the world. What kind of story the Vampire Wars were? The Vampire Wars are the story of a dynasty that pursued 2 goals across 135 years of visible fighting and several additional centuries of less visible preparation, and achieved both goals in ways that were not what the pursuit appeared to be about. The visible goal was the Imperial throne. None of the 3 counts achieved it. Vlad came closest, was killed at the walls of the prize, and did not return. Konrad never approached it in any meaningful sense. Mannfred brought his army to Altdorf's walls twice and was driven back both times. The dynasty that spent more than a century trying to install a von Carstein count as emperor never managed it. The invisible goal was Nagash's resurrection. This was achieved. Mannfred von Carstein stood in the presence of the returned great necromancer and was rewarded and punished by him and served him in the End Times final phase. The project that the von Carstein line had been building toward for centuries was completed, with all the complications and betrayals that Mannfred's character made inevitable. The Vampire Wars are also the story of Sylvania, the province that no one wanted and that kept producing what it produced regardless of who administered it. The dark magic that Vlad found there and worked with, and that each successive count drew on, was not the dynasty's creation. It was what Sylvania was, and the dynasty's relationship to it was the relationship of a force finding and using what the landscape offered. And they are the story of 3 men who were the same kind of being and could not have been more different. Vlad the strategist, who built something and was destroyed by the vulnerability in the thing he built. Konrad the weapon, who was deployed without aim and exhausted without achievement. Mannfred the planner, whose patience outlasted everything and whose betrayal in the final moment was the expression of the same quality that his patience was the expression of the absolute precedence of his own calculation over any other consideration. This has been the entire Vampire Wars timeline. From the Hagendorf fishing village, no, that was Archaon. From Vlad's arrival at Drakenhof Castle in 1797 IC, the stranger who married the dying Count's daughter before the Count had finished dying, who was calm about it the way that very old beings are calm about things. Through the First War and the Second and the Third, and through Hel Fenn and its dark water and the body that went in and did not stay in. Through the centuries of Stirland's administration of a province that remained what it was, to Mannfred's return and his betrayal, and the world that ended partly because of what he chose, from darkness, slowly, for sleep. Sleep well. We have followed 3 counts across 135 years of war and across the several centuries that surrounded those years. From Vlad's arrival at Drakenhof in 1797 IC to Mannfred's betrayal in the final moments of the world that was. From the patience of a being who had been alive since Nehekhara's golden age, to the chaos of a being whose power exceeded his capacity to direct it. From the most cunning campaign any von Carstein launched, to the one decision that undid what the campaign had built toward. Now we sit with what the story was doing underneath the surface of the campaigns. The 3 counts and what they held in common. The differences between Vlad, Konrad and Mannfred are the most visible aspect of the dynasty's history, because they are differences that produce different wars with different characters and different outcomes. But beneath the differences is a commonality that the von Carstein line maintained across all 3 of its major counts. They were all vampires of the same bloodline, which in the Warhammer Fantasy universe means they shared a specific relationship to the world, older than the institutions around them, experienced at a depth that the mortals who opposed them could not match, capable of waiting in ways that mortal patience could not sustain. Vlad had been waiting since Nehekhara. Mannfred had been building since the period of the anarchy that preceded even the First Vampire War. They also shared the particular quality that the von Carstein line expressed above all others, the ambition to rule rather than merely to destroy. The other vampire bloodlines of the Warhammer Fantasy world had their own characters. The Lamians governed through subtlety and manipulation from the shadows. The Necrarchs pursued knowledge for its own sake. The Blood Dragons pursued martial perfection. The Strigoi had fallen into bestial degradation. The von Carsteins wanted power in the visible, political sense. They wanted thrones and provinces, and the title of Emperor, and the formal acknowledgement of the institutions they were trying to control. This made their campaigns different from what a Strigoi incursion or a Necrarch's local operation looked like. More organized, more politically aware, more capable of the kind of sustained strategic planning that 135 years of warfare required. It also made their failures more interesting than a simple military defeat. Vlad did not fail because he was outfought. He failed because of a specific vulnerability in the mechanism of his survival. Konrad did not fail because the Empire was stronger. He failed because his own necromancers betrayed him, when his campaign's trajectory made betrayal the better calculation. Mannfred did not fail at the Vampire Wars at all, in the fullest accounting. He achieved what the dynasty was building toward. The Vampire Wars and the Empire. What the Vampire Wars produced in the Empire's history was not only the defeats and the territory lost and the populations reduced. They produced, across 135 years, the institutional and cultural knowledge of how to fight a sustained undead campaign, led by a vampire of the von Carstein line. This knowledge was not cheap to acquire. The eastern provinces had paid for it in the deaths and the displacement and the decades of instability that the 3 wars had imposed. Stirland's annexation of Sylvania at the war's conclusion was both the administrative resolution of the threat and the inheritance of everything the province's dark history had produced. No other elector wanted what Stirland took, but the knowledge was real, and it accumulated across the 3 wars in ways that the Empire's institutional memory preserved. The tactics that had been developed against undead armies, the understanding of vampiric vulnerabilities and how to exploit them, the role of the witch hunter tradition in managing the supernatural threats that did not rise to the level of a full military campaign, the specific understanding of Sylvania's character and what sustained governance of a province saturated with dark magic required. The empire that existed after the Vampire Wars was better equipped to manage the supernatural threats on its borders than the empire that had existed before them. The cost of that education was enormous. The education was real. What Nagash meant. The recovery of Nagash was not the conclusion the Vampire Wars appeared to be building toward when the First War began. Vlad's campaign was a campaign for the Imperial throne. The hidden purpose of the von Carstein line, the centuries-long accumulation of Nagash's relics, and the pact that Mannfred formalized in Nehekara, was not visible from the outside of the dynasty's history. Nagash's return in the end times was among the most significant events in the Old World's final years. The great necromancer, who had shaped the dark arts across thousands of years of the Old World's history, who had produced the 9 books that the von Carsteins had been accumulating, who had created the conditions that made vampire lords like Vlad possible. He returned to the world and immediately claimed the authority that his ambition had always demanded. Mannfred was his Morturk of Night, the last von Carstein count, the one who had survived Hel Fenn and the centuries of recovery and the careful rebuilding of Drakenhof, occupied a position in the end times undead hierarchy that was both the completion of what the von Carstein project had aimed for and a bitter shadow of the throne that the Vampire Wars had failed to deliver. He had not gotten the Imperial throne. He had gotten the title of Nagash's Morturk, which is a different kind of authority, and not one that any of the 3 counts who prosecuted the Vampire Wars would have recognized as the goal when they began. The Old World and the survivors. The end times produced no clean victories. The Old World was consumed. The world that was ended. The civilizations and the characters and the conflicts that had defined Warhammer Fantasy's universe for decades were resolved not by any of them winning, but by the world in which they existed ceasing to exist. Mannfred's betrayal at the final battle was the act that made the ending possible in the specific way it happened. A different decision in that moment might have produced a different outcome. The coalition that had assembled against chaos had the components necessary to resist what was coming, if those components had held together. Mannfred chose not to hold. Whether he knew what his withdrawal would produce is a question the law holds open. Mannfred, at the height of his cunning, was capable of long-range calculation. Whether the withdrawal was the product of calculation about the world's future, or of the immediate assessment of his own position in the coalition, is the question the ending does not answer. He was there in the age of Sigmar that followed the Old World's destruction. The mortal realms that formed from the wreckage of the world that was included Nagash's domain of Shyish, the realm of death, and the von Carstein name persisted in the new cosmology as Mannfred occupied his place in the undead hierarchy of the New World. The province of Sylvania, which no longer existed as a physical territory after the Old World's end, was preserved in Mannfred's Age of Sigmar as Carstinia, a realm he assembled to replicate the environment and architecture of the province he had governed. Populated by servants he had made to resemble the von Carstein household, and even to wear the faces of Vlad and Isabella and Konrad. The simulacra of a dynasty in a hollow version of the province that had produced it. He acknowledged the hollowness. The lore records that he recognized the fantasy for what it was, the reconstruction of something that could not be reconstructed, because the thing being reconstructed was a dynasty that had ended and a world that was gone. He spent decreasing time in Carsteinia as the acknowledgement settled. The past that he had spent centuries surviving was not a place to return to, and the figure who had always been looking ahead toward the next calculation found that there was always more calculation required. What the Vampire Wars were, in the end. The Vampire Wars were 135 years of warfare that the Empire of Man fought and survived and was changed by, against a dynasty of vampires who wanted first the throne and then the resurrection of the greatest necromancer the world had produced. They were also a story about patience and its limits. Vlad had the patience to wait 2 centuries and was destroyed by the one vulnerability he had not accounted for. Konrad had no patience and demonstrated precisely what happened without it. Mannfred had more patience than Vlad and greater capability and achieved more, in the deepest sense, than either of his predecessors. He also made, in the final moment of the final battle, the decision that patience does not protect against, the decision made in the immediate register of the present moment by a being whose strengths were all long range. The Vampire Wars are the story of what it takes to oppose something very old and very patient, and possessed of resources that mortal armies do not have access to. And they are the story of what very old and very patient things are still capable of in the end, which is the same thing that any being capable of choosing is capable of. Making a choice whose consequences extend beyond what the chooser intended, or chose not to examine, because the immediate register was more compelling than the long view. The world that was ended. Mannfred was there when it ended, and had contributed to the ending. He was in the mortal realms when the new worlds began. The patient survivor of Hel Fenn and 3 centuries of swamp had outlasted the world itself. This has been the entire Vampire Wars timeline. From the fishing village of Hagendorf. No, that was Archaon. From Drakenhof Castle in 1797, and the stranger who was calm about marrying the dying count's daughter because he had been doing this kind of thing for a very long time. Through the 3 counts and the 3 wars and the swamp that kept what it was given. To the end times and what they cost, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my dear friend.